I'm the chair. I'm Elizabeth Tandy Shermer, and as a member of the Loyola History Department, I want to thank you for being here this afternoon for Struggles for Justice, Race, Class, Gender, and Imagination in 1968. And I also want to thank our esteemed panelists for being here. They came from everywhere to be here, and for everyone involved in bringing us together, because I can think of no other way to struggle together, but collectively, especially to learn about what the past and how it might inform the present. I'm going to introduce each panelist before they speak, and then open the floor to questions, comments, and hopefully some answers about why so much of about 68's global struggles seem so present. So first is Judy Susan. Okay, Wu is a professor and chair of Department of Asian American Studies at the University of California, Irvine. She received her PhD in U.S. history from Stanford and previously taught for 17 years at Ohio State University. She authored Dr. Mam Chung of the Fair-Haired Bastards, The Life of a Wartime Celebrity, and Radicals on the Road, Internationalism, Orientalism, and Feminism during the Vietnam Era. Her current book project, a collaboration with political scientist Gwendolyn Mink, explores the political career of Patsy Tomeko Mink, the first woman of color U.S. congressional representative and the co-sponsor of Title IX. Wu was also co-edited Women's America, Refocusing the Past, and Frontiers, a journal of women's studies. She also co-edits Women and Social Movements in the United States, 1600 to 2000. Thank you.
Thank you. Did you want me to speak into here or speak? Okay. Good afternoon. Thank you so much to the organizers for inviting me. It's a great treat to be able to think about 1968. I've been telling my students all year that this is the 50th birthday for me. I was born in 1968, and they usually look at me aghast that someone who could be 50 could be teaching though. So I think of myself as being born twice, once in 1968 and once in 1989. In 1989, I was a sophomore at Stanford University, and there was a racial attack against the African American theme dorm. These are establishments that are open to any student who's interested in learning more about Black history and culture, but some students didn't think that they should exist on our campus, so they went in and defaced flyers, drew what they thought were caricatures of what Black people looked like. This is around the time of the publication of Black Athena and really questioning the European origins of Western civilization. And as I became interested and outraged by these debates, I really reflected on the significance of higher education, that this is not the location where these type of attacks should take place, but that higher education should be a place where people come with different backgrounds and learn from each other's histories and cultures. And as we came together and created a multiracial movement to try to change our campus, we looked back to the 60s and drew inspiration from that particular period of thorough liberation, of the masses organizing, taking on the powers of inequality. I think also we were inspired by the internationalism of the 1980s. It's a period that's often associated with conservatism, with Ronald Reagan, George Bush, but that was also the era of the divestment movement from South Africa. That was also the era in which there are debates about whether Western civilization should be the basis of an education in college. And that was also the era in which Japanese Americans and others mobilized for redress and reparations for internment during World War II. So there were many movements, both locally and globally and nationally, that shaped our imagination. And I think a lot of us thought of ourselves following in some ways to the tradition of the 60s. So it's a wonderful opportunity for me to share what I think are some of the key legacies of the 60s, and obviously it's a very selective take, but I think these are the lessons that I want to carry forth to future generations. So one of the things I really want to emphasize is the rise of third worldism, and that really is exemplified by the year 1968 in terms of the Vietnam War. This is a war which I think many of you have already pointed out, that really sparked the political imagination and a sense of political justice for people around the world. But it was the year of the Tet Offensive, and even though the United States called that a military victory, it was a political defeat for the United States, because up until then, there's all these discussions from official sources that the United States was winning the war. And to have a series of coordinated attacks, not just in rural areas, but in urban areas throughout South Vietnam, really shocked the world and moved moderates like Walter Cronkite to finally asking, what exactly are we doing there? Is it just a stagmire? Is it just a quagmire? Are we ever going to be able to resolve this war? It's also the year 1968 when the Third World Liberation Front was formed in San Francisco and in Berkeley, and they formed to help democratize higher education. I think that's something that Nelson was talking about earlier. Democratize in multiple ways. One, in terms of thinking about who should be within universities, not just the traditional elite, not just white males, but thinking about broadly people of color, women, really transforming the demographics of university. But in addition to that, they were really trying to transform the curricular content. That it's not the university as an ivory tower, but it's a university that's socially and politically engaged with the pressing issues of society at that time. So people going to San Francisco State are looking at urban slums like San Francisco Chinatown and asking what are the intellectual tools that we can use to address the deep-seated inequalities that exist in those communities. This third worldism is something that I'm attracted to, given my personal history. But it also was something that was really important to me when I was teaching in the Midwest, when I felt that Asian Americans were very much invisible. That the way in which race tends to be understood is very much along black and white lines, increasingly along black, white, and brown lines, but the ways in which Asian Americans are configured in that political conversation tends to be as model minorities. And that is a construct that emerges in the mid-60s, this is a group that might have suffered discrimination in the case of Japanese Americans, that they had been interned, but that they work hard and they have strong families, that they can overcome these forces of racism. And if we believe that they can overcome this, then why not these other groups? Is it more about personal failings, like lack of discipline, lack of families, as opposed to the articulation of systematic critiques of racial hierarchy and capital and class hierarchies and gender hierarchies? And so the ways in which Asian Americans are often invisibilized, they're seen as antithetical to political activism, really motivated me to think about, well, in what ways did they inspire the political imaginary of the 60s and 70s? So this top image I wanted to share with you is the banner mast for the Black Panther Party newspaper. This was their international section. And many of you, I think, already know the history of the Panthers. But when I saw this, I was really struck by the fact that 3 out of the 5 icons that they celebrate were Asian. Right? We have Patrice Lumumba, we have Ho Chi Minh, Che Guevara, Kim Il-sung, Mao Zedong. Right? There's a way in which socialist Asia looms large in the terms of political imagination. Vietnam, I think China is a little bit more obviously, but these nations are representing anti-colonial efforts to resist Western imperialism, or at least that's one interpretation of what they're doing. And you might think about North Korea, although less understandable to people at the time, falling into this longer tradition of decolonization during the post-World War II period. This particular image really follows on a set of journeys that the Black Panther Party undertakes throughout the period of the late 60s and early 70s, and most notably Eldridge Cleaver took a cross-section of American anti-war activists and anti-imperialist activists, as they call themselves, to North Korea, North Vietnam, and China. And that included 2 Asian American activists. But I wanted to see, again, to think about how socialist Asia, decolonizing Asia, was inspiring the political imaginary of radicals throughout the world, including the United States. And this political imagination was actually fundamental to the creation of the whole identity of being Asian American. I think people sort of throw it around now as a descriptive term, but it was invented in 1968 as a political category. The sense that it didn't matter which country, which generation, which culture that you identify with or practice, but that all these groups are somehow collectively one identity. And that political category was really based on a critique of American racism and American imperialism. So American racism, thinking about the passage of immigration exclusion laws in the late 19th, early 20th century. I often tell my students that Asians are the first undocumented immigrants to this country because they were the first group that was excluded from the United States nation. Right? It actually takes legality to create illegality. Right? And obviously, in the war in Vietnam, it raised the consciousness of Asian American activists here about the connection with people that they identify with racially, ancestrally. So the second image that's here is an Asian American contingent of an anti-war movement. And you see the titles on their slogans, right? Asian genocide, stop the bombing of Asian people. There was a really interesting comment in the earlier session about the possibility of use of nuclear weaponry in Vietnam and how that was sort of beyond the pale politically. But one of the things that really strikes me about the ways in which the Vietnam War was fought is that if you take all the bombs that were dropped during World War II, which is a global war, and you triple that, that's how much was dropped in Vietnam, right? Triple the amount of the bombs in World War II. And twice as many of those bombs were dropped in South Vietnam, which is the United States ally. So I think about a quote that was, that became sort of circulated at the time, right? In order to save, right, this town, this village, this country from communism, we have to destroy it. Just kind of the level of militarism, the warfare that was inflicted on this country. And it wasn't just conventional weapons, but chemical ones. I've had a chance to visit Vietnam twice, and the last visit coincided with the 40th anniversary of the Paris Peace Accord. And we visited residential educational institutions for children who are suffering the after effects of Agent Orange. So these are children who are born maybe 2, 3 generations removed from the war, but those chemicals that were used do not dissipate. Right? And some of the bombs that were dropped do not dissipate. They're still embedded in the landscapes of Vietnam. So again, this has got a particular racialized understanding of the war. It wasn't just about saving American lives. It wasn't about withdrawing US troops, right, the Americanization strategy, or the Vietnamization strategy and replacing them with Asian fighters, but to think about the ways in which the war was a racial war. So I'm going to shift a little bit to thinking about how this politics of third-worldism was also connected very deeply with the politics of feminism. So in 1968, that's often regarded as this shift of feminism from a sort of a liberal approach to feminism, women getting equal access to the political system, economic opportunities, as the dominant mode of feminist organizing, right, liberal feminism, as opposed to radical feminism or women's liberation. And that's the phase that coined the term, the personal is political, right? Who does the housework? The personal dynamics between men and women. Those all reflect broader social hierarchies. And the event that usually is used to demarcate that shift from liberal to radical is the 1968 protest, the Miss America pageant, in which women are throwing in right, these items that foster the objectification of the female body and protesting these types of accoutrements that turn women primarily into sex objects, right? And that's where the term bra burner comes out, although no bras actually were burned. So I want to think, along with other people, in challenging this characterization of liberal versus radical, and also more broadly, the ways in which feminism is taught, which is usually first wave, culmination of suffrage, second wave, 1960s, 1970s, third wave, and so on. Because various people have critiqued that those categorizations tend to privilege white middle-class women as the center of feminism. And so various people have said, well, what if we thought about working class women? What if we thought about immigrant women? What if we thought about women of color? Well, we come up with a different chronology, a different way of categorizing these different types of feminisms. And also, the split between liberal and radical could be much more complicated than just thinking about demarcation. So I'm going to give you 2 different examples of thinking about this. One, again, thinks about the global. The ways in which Vietnam, I think, was imagined more popularly was that it was a country, a cause, a movement that represented the ultimate underdog, right? This is a predominantly agricultural society. This is a country that had been dominated by the French, and before that, they were dominated by the Chinese. It had been fighting a multi-decade war for national liberation. This is not a highly sophisticated country that's going toe-to-toe with the United States in terms of military might or financial resources. But they're able to fight the war at a standstill, right? And one of the key figures that gets circulated during this time period is the one on your right. This is a Japanese-American, Asian-American movement publication, but this particular image also surfaced in the Black Panthers, and a version of this image circulated in other radical newspapers at that time. And it is of the peasant woman with the baby and the gun. So I was looking around this exhibit, and there's a very powerful image of a Vietnamese woman who just looks like she has suffered devastating impact of the war, right? She just looks horrified. She looks at a loss of what to do. And there were other images like that circulated, oftentimes with children. And so I think of them as Vietnamese Madonna images. And those images, I think, is inviting people from far away to say, look at me, I am also human, and I need your morality, I need your ethics, I need you to stand up and say this war has to end, right? It's inviting people to help rescue them. In this image, This woman is not looking for rescue. She is going to rescue herself. Right? She can find some compatibility between being a mother and also being a warrior. And I think this image was incredibly empowering, and actually also a series of international meetings between Vietnamese women and other women were incredibly empowering for women who are here thinking about, well, what does it mean to achieve equality? In Vietnam, Vietnamese women were serving as generals. Right? That was not comparable to here. In socialist Vietnam, they were considering how do we equalize the position of women in our society because everybody is needed to fight this war. Right? So there's political lessons in which Vietnamese women are imparting. And one example of that is Vivian Rothstein, who was active in Students for Democratic Society. She traveled to Eastern Europe to meet with members of the Viet Cong, to meet with members of North Vietnam, to learn in person the impact of the war. And when she's there, members of the Vietnamese Women's Union pulls her aside and said, we want to have a women's meeting. And this is something that was very unusual for Vivian. She had been involved in coeducational spaces like the SDS, and to have a separate meeting focusing on just women and talking about women's issues in terms of the war was something that was very eye-opening for her. And in these meetings, they were sharing what Joanne Nagel might describe as the military sexual complex, the ways in which military presence foster certain forms of sexualized violence, sexualized economic practices that fundamentally transform those societies in which the US military is based. So this includes the use of rape as a wartime tactic. This includes the rise of prostitution in places that have US military bases. So I won't go too much further in that. But as Vivian met with these women from the Vietnamese Women's Union, she was also invited then to travel to North Vietnam, and she did so. And when she was there, she learned about the Vietnamese Women's Union, the way that it was structured, the types of activities and goals that they were engaged in. And when she comes back to Chicago, she helps to form the Chicago Women's Liberation Union. So it's not a coincidence that she's using some of the same titles, the names, that she's learning from Vietnamese women abroad, and that she's bringing back with her some ideas of political organizing, political mobilization. So in many ways, these women abroad are introducing her to feminist organizing and feminist models of organizing. The other person who's here, and I know David Farber has had a chance to work with Patsy Mink. She was the first woman of color to become a US Congresswoman, went into Congress in 1965, left in 1977, went back in 1990, and passed away in 2002. And in fact, she was so supported, beloved by her constituency that even after she passed away, they elected her to Congress. So as you can tell from the image and from what I just told you, she was someone who worked within the system. She was a political representative, right? So how do we make sense of something like the woman with the baby and the gun and someone like Patsy Mink? And I really want to argue that we need to think about the blurring of these political categories. You might think about Patsy Mink as a liberal feminist, but in fact, when someone made that comment, she said, how dare you think that I'm a liberal, right? I'm a radical. I'm working with movement activists, and I'm trying to figure out ways to translate some of those politics into political legislation. So some examples of things that she engaged in. She was an anti-war advocate. She was someone who was very much concerned about the environment. She was trying to protest nuclear and chemical and military testing throughout the Pacific. And she was a huge advocate in terms of women's issues, gender equity issues. She's the namesake for Title IX, which I think many people don't know. Right? So Title IX is named after Patsy Mink. And many people have critiqued Title IX for various reasons, and there's definitely room for improvement for what that law represents. But it was something that opened up, transformed our educational institutions. So Title IX says that you need to offer gender equity, gender opportunities, if you want to receive federal funds. And so that affected all realms of education. That affected admissions. It affected scholarships. It affected housing. It affected staffing, right? It wasn't just a sports initiative, but it was all realms of education. And I can tell you more about how I think her particular location as a woman of color, someone who's from Hawaii, shaped some of her feminist politics. And I'll just give you a couple more other things that she achieved or we're trying to advocate for. She advocated for the Women's Educational Equity Act. So Title IX was about trying to prevent discrimination. The Women's Educational Equity Act helped fund women's studies, women's centers, so that you fundamentally transform the curriculum. So it's not so much about preventing discrimination, but fostering a different type of educational culture that can change the way that people think about issues of gender. She also played a leading role in creating the National Women's Conference in 1977. In 1975, women came together around the world in Mexico City to develop a United Nations and international agenda for women's issues. In 1977, Mink and other people convinced the US government to also have its own national conference to develop a national agenda for women's issues and to present this to Congress and to the president. But she and others also wanted it not just to be a top-down, one-time event. Instead, they funded 56 pre-conferences, 50 in every state, and 6 within territories. She's from Hawaii, and so she was highly sensitive to issues of colonialism, of differential political status. I think I will stop there, but I just want to say 2 more things about Patsy Mink. One is that there's a great documentary about her called Ahead of the Majority, so in case you're interested in finding out more. But I love that phrase of being ahead of the majority, which is that she says it's easy enough to vote with the majority, right? It's easy if you just follow along politically. But it's so much more important to stake out a political position and to mobilize people, to convince them that that is the right thing for our society, our country, our nation to do. The other quote I really like from Patsy Mink, it's in the documentary as well, but she says, I've run many times, so she ran for election many times, and I've lost many times. But that has not changed her belief that she as an individual and that we as individuals can make a difference. So let me just end by thinking about what I think are the legacies of 1968 that I want to continue to advocate for the students that I interact with and with the communities I talk to. One of the most powerful things I think about that time period is a sense that whatever is happening in the world, that there's an intimate connection to where we are located. That it could be in Mexico City, it could be Prague, it could be in Vietnam, that these are places that are far away from many people, but it mattered, right? It mattered to people in Chicago or in California and other parts of the world. I think the other thing that I really want to emphasize is that this is a period of incredible political imagination, that people are coming together and trying to figure out what are the best ways, right, to critique systems of racial and gender and class and other forms of inequality, and what are the visions, what are the ways in which we want to move that society forward. And then finally, that there needs to be creative expressions about how to do that, whether it's at the local level, at the national level, whether it's inside the system or outside the system. But I think those are the lessons that I think we should take away from this particular time period. Thank you.
Next up, Malgorzata Fidelis, an associate professor in the University of Illinois Chicago's History Department, just right down the road and west, where she also directs graduate studies. Her research focuses on social and cultural issues, particularly everyday life and the relationship between individuals and the state power in post-1945 Eastern Europe. Her first book, entitled Women, Communism, and Industrialization in Postwar Poland, is a study of female workers and communist policies in Poland. The book's central theme explores how communist leaders in society reconciled pre-communist traditions with radically new norms imposed by the communist ideology. Her new research project concerns the social and cultural history of the global 60s in Poland, with a particular emphasis on youth and student cultures in a transnational context.
Happy 1968, everyone, from Brigitte Bardot. I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to this symposium. I work on the part of the world that does not figure prominently in the studies of Global 1968. I work on the second world, and in particular on Poland and Eastern Europe. So it seems that the only image that makes its way to the global imagery of 1968 is the Soviet tanks in Prague, but we really know very little beyond that, beyond the crashing of the Prague Spring. And there is a reason for this marginalization. The story of the global 60s, as experienced on the other side of the Iron Curtain, does not always conform to the dominant narrative of a global anti-colonial, anti-racist, anti-capitalist struggles launched in the first and third worlds. Third worldism, in particular, presented challenges to Eastern European actors due to their geopolitical positionality outside of the capitalist world and within the Soviet rather than the American imperial project. But if we want to be global, we of course need to include as many places in the world as we can, and certainly the Second World plays a part. So when we look at Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, we find that it is seemingly the communist regimes that stood for all the movements that the global 60s represented. The Communist Party states were, in their public rhetoric, anti-colonial, anti-racist, anti-capitalist. They claimed to have liberated their populations from capitalist oppression. And they also saw themselves as the champions of the post-colonial world, believing that the third world was on the path towards communism. But of course, the Soviet and Eastern European regimes were one-party dictatorships. We don't really need to go into this. So my question is, if you were a young person in Poland or other parts of Eastern Europe, sensitive to social justice, conscious of the gap between the state pronouncements and the reality, and aware of global liberation movements such as decolonization or the international student protests, what would you do? How do you put yourself on the global stage of youth revolts? In my presentation today, and I will get to Brigitte Bardot, but it will take me a little. So today I would like to focus on the attempts of some young people in Poland, in particular leftist students, to challenge the state monopoly on the language of social justice and liberation, to develop their own alternative to the state's understanding of domestic and international politics. And my task is daunting because the story is very complicated and I have only 15 or 20 minutes, but I will try. I will give you a spoiler because I don't know if I will actually get to the end of the story. There was no happy ending. In March 1968, student and youth demonstrations erupted all over Poland. And this happened early in 1968, so this is before the French May and all other student demonstrations in other parts of the world. As elsewhere, the student and youth revolt in Poland was crushed by the state. Moreover, the ruling party launched a powerful anti-Semitic campaign against student leaders and intellectuals who supported the students. Student leaders were vilified as Zionists, agents of Israel, the United States, and West Germany. Don't ask me about this combination. And also as cosmopolitans, spoiled children who indulged in Western-style consumerism. They were also vilified as hippies and all the vocabulary that you could also see coming from the conservative regimes in the West towards young rebels. In the end, 13,000 Polish Jews emigrated. In this regard, 1968 in Poland has multiple meanings. It is a year of student and youth revolt. But 1968 also marks the end of the post-Holocaust Jewish community in Poland. And here is another global connection. Both the communist regimes and the conservative capitalist regimes elsewhere in the world reacted in strikingly similar ways to upheavals from below. They often mobilized nationalism and racism, and often in quite effective ways. In the end, in 1968, the alternative leftist political vision in Poland was defeated, and the non-communist left never recovered. At the same time, the anti-Semitic campaign solidified the exclusionary racial understanding of the Polish nation, which had lasting political consequences, and it can be actually felt today in Poland. So let's go back to Brigitte Bardot. Through the 1960s, Poland was a liminal place. After 1956, that is after the end of Stalinism, the Polish communist regime pursued its own version of state socialism, and they called this the Polish road to socialism, which meant that they were more open to the West, more open to the world than other countries in the Soviet bloc. They had some autonomy in domestic policies, but at the same time, they were, of course, firmly within the Eastern Bloc. They were member of the Warsaw Pact and in close alliance with the Soviet Union. So, in short, Poland had one foot in the West and one foot in the Soviet bloc. And one of the consequences of that liminality was a relatively vibrant youth culture that was very much attuned to global trends in fashion, music, and lifestyles, new lifestyles. Many young women, in fact, wanted to be like Brigitte Bardot. After the end of Stalinism in 1956, the state departed from repression and coercion as the primary way of relating to society. The state dismantled the terror machine, and now the new way to relate to social actors was to provide incentives for different groups to support the communist rule. They pursued what we can call a version of socialist modernity that included enhancing the standard of living, promoting moderate consumption, leisure, and entertainment. And of course, the state also wanted to bond with the young people because they were the new generation. At that time, in the mid-1950s, a new genre of youth magazines emerged. So yes, the communist propaganda changed a lot before 1956 and after. And these new youth magazines departed from political and ideological content associated with Stalinism and instead focused on educational, leisure, and entertainment. And these magazines also featured a lot of materials from the Western press. It really contradicts if you think about Eastern Europe as a totalitarian place, when you look at the youth magazines, it contradicts that kind of notion. Popular culture also provided a space for limited debates about some of the global trends of the 60s, such as cultural liberalization or youth movements. Young people were also encouraged to form emotional bonds with the global South. The state supported the Cuban Revolution, for example. And it's interesting that the revolution here is represented by a gorgeous blonde. And we could spend another 2 hours, I guess, analyzing this image, especially from gender perspective. But I also wanted to point out the emphasis on the nation. The connection that the state wanted to build between Poland and the global South were often based on the struggle for national liberation rather than for some international project of communism. Some young people, however, attempted to find their own way of understanding the world beyond the popular culture or the state political propaganda. For some young people, especially students, it was not enough to be a virtual tourist and to limit themselves to dancing the twist or consuming popular images. Some young people, in fact, wanted to engage with politics and engage on their own terms. So in the early 1960s, we have some groups of usually high school students and university students emerging. And this is one of them, one of the most important. They called themselves the Club of the Seekers of Contradictions. They identified themselves as Marxists, but argued that the Soviet and Eastern European regimes contradicted Marxism. They were not really Marxist. This is a group of high school students. And this group was created by Adam Mikhnik, who would become a major figure in the anti-communist opposition in the 1970s and the 1980s. He started this club in 1962. And these were young people who represented global trends in youth culture, cultural liberalization, new modes of sociability. But they also discussed Marx and other books. And they called themselves Seekers of Contradictions because they usually were trying to find discrepancies between Marxist philosophy and the practice of the Polish communist state. When these young people entered universities, they changed the name, actually not by themselves, but they were called by others the Commandos. And why they were called the Commandos? The name came from the tactic they employed. Like a specialized military unit, they dropped on lectures and meetings at the University of Warsaw with the purpose of fomenting ideological disruption. So they would basically come to some meeting with a party official and ask very inconvenient questions or provide alternative interpretations of Marxism. And these young people were very much influenced by young intellectuals, two of them in particular, Karol Modzelewski and Jacek Kuroń. In 1964, Kuroń and Modzelewski wrote the open letter to the party. And that letter offered an alternative leftist vision of social justice and international solidarity. Although the letter is very long and it's very hard to read because they have a lot of economic analysis, and it's about Eastern Europe, basically. But at the same time, they also put forward a vision of a global workers' uprising that they saw coming. And this upheaval, according to the authors, was to be driven by the entangled forces of de-Stalinization in Eastern Europe and decolonization in the Third World. The authors identified the Cold War division as a product of cooperation between Western imperialists and Soviets directed at suppressing genuine democratic movements from below. And they also believed that the rebellions in the East-South periphery produced conditions ripe for another socialist revolution and a genuine workers' democracy. They didn't really elaborate on this vision, but they said this. I mean, they wrote this. They submitted the letter to the party. The next day, they were arrested. So the Commandos were inspired by this kind of leftist critique. And I wanted to show one example of a leaflet that the Commandos produced in October 1967. It was called the Vietnam Leaflet. So it really shows how they engaged in global issues from their position, very local position. And I wanted to show you the language that these young rebels used. And they used this language not only in this leaflet, but in other writings and illegal demonstrations. In general, Vietnam posed challenges for young leftist rebels in Poland because the Eastern European regimes were very much against the American intervention. It was part of the official propaganda, basically. They supported anti-war protests, so they left very little room for any other leftists to enter the conversation. But I mean, you can see in this leaflet, they attempted to appropriate and at the same time challenge the official language. We have statements that repudiated imperialist politics. They express solidarity with the transnational left, mostly the new left. But in the third paragraph, you can also see that they list injustices inflicted on small nations by great powers. The Munich Agreement and the invasion, the revolution, the Hungarian Revolution in 1956. This is a reference to the Soviet invasion of Hungary. They also expressed solidarity with Czech intellectuals. So they are basically saying that Americans are guilty of imperialism, but Soviets are guilty of imperialism as well. And of course, the leaflet annoyed the Polish party leaders. They confiscated the copies. They harassed the students. The end of the commandos activity and this kind of challenge to the hegemonic narrative of the communist state came in 1968. And to make the long story short, the protests in March 1968 started with a student gathering at the Warsaw University. It was a gathering in defense of intellectual freedoms, and they also demanded the release of 2 students who were arrested for participating in an earlier demonstration. The names of those students were Adam Mikhnik, who you may remember from the Club of the Seekers of Contradictions, and the other one was Henryk Schleifer. It was a peaceful gathering, but the demonstration was attacked by male civilians armed with clubs by the party and by the riot police, on the orders of the party, of course. When the word about the beatings of students spread, mass protests by young people exploded all over Poland, and not only by university students, but also by high school students and by young workers, to show solidarity with the Warsaw students. In the end, thousands of young people were arrested, dismissed from schools, and as I mentioned before, the state launched this public, powerful anti-Semitic campaign against the protesters. Eventually, after 1968, many of the 1968 leaders, rebels like Adam Mikhnik, would become key figures in the organized opposition against the communist regime in the 1970s and the 1980s. But they would also change their orientation from transnational, from attempts to connect with other parts of the world, to very inward-looking. They would become preoccupied very much with nationalism and national legitimacy. In the late 1980s, most of the 68ers would also champion neoliberal capitalism, and they also shaped the transition of Poland from communism to neoliberal capitalism. So to conclude, 2 broader points that I would like to make in terms of how the Second World affects our understanding of the global 60s. Well, first, we need to recognize the multiplicity of the 60s. There is really no single story. We have upheavals in many corners of the world, but they all have their own local dynamics, and they also have their own understanding of the global sphere. And the second, we need to recognize the extent and the power of global backlash against upheavals from below, and their impact on politics even today. In the case of Poland, as young rebels tried to take on both American and Soviet imperialism, they moved beyond the Cold War divide in a truly global sense. But sustaining such commitment proved unworkable in an environment in which the communist state held a virtual monopoly over the public representation of anti-imperialism and Polish national identity. And the state used that, and one may say the state weaponized the transnational imagination in a different way from students, not to seek any kind of transnational solidarity, but to vilify youth rebellion as foreign infiltration. Thank you.
Last but not least is Alan Shane Dillingham, an assistant professor of Latin American history at Spring Hill College in Mobile, Alabama. For those you don't know, another Jesuit college. That is not why we invited him. We invited him because his scholarly interests include race and indigeneity, labor and youth movements, and the history of education and development. He is completing a book manuscript, Insurgent Oaxaca, A History of Indigeneity, Development, and Inequality in the 20th Century, which examines the intersection of the 60s anti-colonial politics and policies of indigenous development. His work has been supported by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and the American Council of Learned Societies, the Inter-American Foundation, the National Academy of Education, otherwise known as the Spencer Foundation, and of course, the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Smithsonian. Please welcome Dr. Dillingham.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. The climate here is a bit different than Mobile, Alabama, where I woke up this morning, but it's good to be with you. I want to thank the organizers for hosting me, and particularly Ellie for putting together this great panel. I feel like our work is really speaking to each other's, and I've been very energized by my fellow panelists' remarks. So what I thought I would do before we get started is I thought I would begin with one of the most iconic images of global 1968. This is an image that I often use with my students. And if you'll indulge me, what do we know about what's happening here? Remember, participation is 15% of your overall grade. Yeah, so this is a good point. The person who placed second, this is a 200-meter dash. This is Peter Norman. He does kind of look like the awkward white guy standing next to something else that's apart from him, but he's actually participating. He's a member. He has a button. I don't have my pointer, but he has the Olympic Committee for Human Rights, which all three of the athletes are wearing buttons. He's part of this protest, so he's standing in solidarity with the other athletes. What else do we know about this image? Yeah.
How come they're using different arms? Do they coordinate?
Right. Yeah, so they have their arms raised, but one is raising their left, the other is raising the right. Yeah.
I hope I didn't miss this, but they're not, Tommy and Sean aren't wearing shoes.
Yeah, so Tommy Smith and John Carlos, these are the two U.S. sprinters who respectively placed first and third in this race. Yeah, so they have their arms raised and they're not wearing shoes. In terms of their arms raised, my understanding is that they accidentally only brought one pair of gloves. If you notice, it's the same pair of gloves. And so they only had one pair of gloves, so they were reduced to raising the left and right arms respectively. Anybody know why they wanted to wear gloves? Michael Jackson. No, yeah, my students oftentimes talk about the Black Panther Party for self-defense. What I've read for them, I don't think that was necessarily. I think one of the interesting things is this image, of course, becomes associated with Black Power. But at the time, no one had seen this before, right? I think we oftentimes bring our contemporary kind of understandings back onto the image. According to Tommy Smith and John Carlos, they wanted to wear gloves because upon receiving the medals, they anticipated that they were going to have to shake hands with a man named Avery Brundage. Avery Brundage was the head of the International Olympic Committee. He was a German-American, which he prided himself in. He had participated in the Olympics when they were hosted in Berlin and was understood to be a racist and an anti-Semite. And so Tommy Smith and John Carlos have claimed that if they were going to have to shake hands with Avery Brundage, they were going to wear gloves to do so. And why did they take the medal stand without shoes? Anybody?
Solidarity with poor Black people.
Yeah, I think that what they've narrated is that they wanted to represent poverty in the United States, and so they took the medal stand without shoes. And you can see in the color picture, they also are wearing beads around their necks, and they've told the story that they wanted to also represent lynchings in the United States. And so this is this kind of iconic image of global 1968. And I think one of the things that when I talk to my students about it, most of them, if they've recognized the image, they kind of associate it with like Puff Daddy's version of this image or something. He's not called that anymore, but they frequently can't place where the image took place, right? And that is in Mexico, in Mexico City. And so it takes place in the Summer Olympics, which Mexico hosts. Mexico is the first developing country to host the Olympics. And so what I thought I would do today is I work on 20th century Latin America, and I've kind of worked on the 1960s in Latin America, and I wanted to share with you some thoughts about Mexico 1968, and I've entitled this A View from the South. One of my kind of, I found it very productive to think with the literature of global 1968 and the way that it kind of connects a kind of transnational history of a year of protest and revolt. But I think as some of the other speakers have alluded to, I also think like with any framework, there are some disadvantages to Global 68 as a framework. And so that might kind of be animating or motivating some of my comments here today. I think one of the challenges with thinking about a Global 1968 is thinking about a Global 1968 that doesn't center, for example, Paris, Chicago, or Berkeley, right? Oftentimes when we talk about 1968, the points of reference are deeply American or European. And so that creates challenges for those of us working in countries that don't quite fit into that narrative. And so I just kind of wanted to flag that now. I have a friend who works on Guatemala, and she was like, Global 1968, global baloney. She didn't find this framework compelling. I tried to make the case. I think there's a productive things that the framing does for us, but I just wanted to kind of flag that as I go forward. And so I wanted to talk a bit about in the preceding months prior to Mexico's hosting in the Olympic Games, Mexico witnesses a major student movement that lasts from the beginning of the summer through the fall. Mexico hosts the Olympics in October of 1968. It's the Summer Olympics. They do that, I think, for reasons relating to weather. And I don't want to steal the thunder of a presentation, a panel that we're having tomorrow afternoon, which deals with Mexico in 1968 specifically. But for me to kind of get to some of my contributions, I have to at least make some references to that Mexico City movement. And the Mexico City student movement begins, like many of the student movements in the 1960s, over relatively kind of bread and butter issues, right? There's high school students get into a fight in downtown Mexico City. That fight in July of that summer is repressed by the Granaderos, Mexico City's riot police, and that leads to a kind of escalation, a series of protests against police brutality, continued repression, and escalation of the movement. And so by August of 1968, students in Mexico City and beyond have organized what they call the Consejo Nacional de Huelga, or the National Strike Council. And so you see a movement kind of with humble beginnings developing a strong coordinating network that articulates demands between Mexico's national university, the UNAM, and as well as the Polytechnic University located also in Mexico City. The students have many demands. Among them are ones that we might anticipate: university reform. Students are entering higher education in larger and larger numbers in the 1960s. Part of the demands are about housing, campus infrastructure, et cetera. But they go on to call for the abolition of the riot police who had been cracking heads in Mexico City. They call for the abolition of Cold War treason laws that criminalize dissent in Mexico. And they're calling for kind of broader press freedoms in Mexico City. Mexico at the time is ruled by the Institutional Revolutionary Party, the PRI and its Spanish acronym. It's a party that emerges out of the Mexican Revolution of 1910 and maintains a revolutionary discourse throughout the 20th century. It does not lose presidential power in Mexico until 2000, when the former head of Coca-Cola in Mexico, Vicente Fox, defeats the PRI. So in Mexico in 1968, students, I think, like maybe our second world counterparts in other parts of the world, are confronting a government that rules in the name of revolution, right? They're not confronting politicians like Richard Nixon or things like that. They're confronting a government that claims to rule in the name of revolution. And so here on the left, I've put two dueling definitions of revolution. The Secretary of Interior of Mexico basically occupies a kind of position as vice president, claims that the student protesters are actually getting in the way of the upward course of the Mexican Revolution, right? And so these students are often similarly cast as kind of privileged students by government officials, manipulated strangely by either Cuban agents or the CIA, which is hard to kind of square, that they could be manipulated by both those forces in 1968, but these are the claims made by various elements of the Mexican government. And then on the right, you have a quote from a student at the National University, right, who takes up a major symbol of revolt, Che Guevara, the Argentine revolutionary who's killed 1 year previously in 1967 in Bolivia by the Bolivian army and elements of the CIA. And so they kind of take Che as their revolutionary figure in opposition to the revolutionary nationalism that had dominated Mexican politics in much of the 20th century. Now, the students also are keenly aware that Mexico's hosting these Olympic Games. And so they're very strategic in their protests. They take up imagery from the 1968 Olympics. Here on the right, you see a sign where they have labeled with the Olympic rings, instead of the Year of Peace, which was the slogan of the Olympics, they entitle it the Year of Repression. And they do that to kind of strategically leverage the Mexican government to make reforms because the Mexican government is concerned about ensuring stability for its upcoming games. They also, interestingly, in some of their graffiti, they turn the Olympic rings upside down and they draw a tank over it to describe the Mexican government's policies during that year. Things escalate by early fall, and so on September 18th, the Mexican military rolls onto the Ciudad Universitaria's campus, the Mexico City campus of the National University, and occupies it. Students flee, they hide in dormitory buildings, some are captured. Now, all of this culminates on October 2nd, 1968, a day that many of you may have heard of. This is when the Mexican military, most likely directed, we don't still know all the details, by the Interior Secretary, Luis Echeverria, who is still alive. They're directed to open fire on a peaceful demonstration of students on the afternoon of October 2nd. And so students had gathered in downtown Mexico City, just north of the city center, for those of you who know it, in a plaza called Tlatelolco, which is a Nahua term. And in the afternoon, both uniformed soldiers, this is one of the few pictures that is published in the aftermath of 1968, as well as non-uniformed special units who were stationed in the buildings surrounding the plaza, open fire. And the number of dead is unknown. The higher estimates are around 300. Some kind of more moderate government estimates put it at 30. But this is oftentimes viewed in Mexican historiography as a kind of parteaguas, or a watershed moment in Mexican history. Now, the narratives that we have about Mexico in 1968 are oftentimes the ones produced by members of the student movement themselves. And so the government denied what had happened in the aftermath. They go on to successfully host the Olympics. The Olympics kind of go off without a hitch in October of 1968. And so it's really a kind of student movement, kind of a civic society movement that tries to tell the story of 1968, narrate those who have died, those who are detained. Many thousands of students were detained in a prison, a 19th century prison in Mexico City after the fact. And those memoirs have been really important, and I think we'll probably hear more about them tomorrow, in terms of telling a story that was denied by the Mexican government, and kind of claiming, trying to fight for accountability. No Mexican officials have ever been held accountable for the massacre. Luis Echeverria, as I mentioned, is still alive today. No charges have ever been brought against him. And I think it's been a really important way that Mexican civil society has called for democracy, because this seemed to be a moment in which the government had revealed its kind of stark authoritarian character. even recently, right, in the last few years, there's been a disappearance and presumed murder of 43 college students in Mexico, in Ayotzinapa. And much of the government initially claimed they were killed by low-level kind of drug gangs, but now the serious reporting suggests that it was drug trafficking cartels working in collaboration with the Mexican military, whose obviously head is the Mexican president, who facilitated their disappearance. And so slogans in 1968 and today oftentimes are the same. Fue el Estado, right? It was the state. And that has been a really important way that 1968 reverberates in Mexican politics today. Today we have an incoming Mexican president, Lopez Obrador, who will be the first non-PRI, non-PAN president of Mexico, who will take power here in just a few months. So these have been really, I think, important narratives of the 1968 student movement. But I think they also have limited our ability to understand dissident politics in Mexico more broadly, right? And so like many other memoirs of 1968 that are produced internationally, not just in Mexico, but throughout the world, they center the stories of, relatively often middle-class, university-based students in urban cities who led these student movements. They tell those stories as kind of heroic narratives against an authoritarian or corrupt government. And while those narratives have been important, they oftentimes kind of frame Mexican student politics as one similar to those of Paris or the United States. They draw those kind of connections to Western world parallel experiences of student protests. And they oftentimes don't really reckon with the diversity of youth politics in Mexico itself during the 1960s. And so in my own work, which is kind of focuses on the politics of indigenous development and anti-colonialism in the 1960s, I try to focus on indigenous youth who also participate in politics during this period, and I focus on the southern state of Oaxaca, which is about now 6 hours by bus south of Mexico City. And what I've tried to do is focus on the kind of professional formation and politicization of indigenous youth who were contracted as agents of development in southern Mexico. And southern Mexico, as most people, some people may know, is the poorest part of Mexico. The states of Guerrero, Oaxaca, and Chiapas are all predominantly rural, poor states, and also states of incredible linguistic and cultural diversity. And so Oaxaca has over 16 recognized indigenous communities, Zapotec, Mixtec, Mije, Chatino, et cetera. We could talk about that for quite a while. And so in the 1960s, indigenous youth, particularly in 1968, are contracted to be brokers of development projects in the state of Oaxaca. And it's there that they start to come into contact with the kind of radical political ideas that are kind of fermenting throughout the world. And so I can show you a picture here if I have it. These indigenous youth are contracted to be agents of development projects that include kind of literacy campaigns, public health, vaccination campaigns, agricultural, kind of horticulture projects for small communities in Oaxaca. But as they are kind of in their classroom and they spend about a year training in 1968 to be agents of development, and these are some of them here pictured in this picture, they come into contact with university students who had actually studied in Mexico City. Some of them you could kind of describe as like new left anthropologists who after their studies had gone out into the countryside to kind of put their ideas in practice. They come into contact with Catholic kind of liberation theology activists who are doing also Spanish language literacy because these are oftentimes monolingual indigenous communities. Language is a really important part of this moment. And they also are in dialogue with variants of Marxism and other forms of kind of, particularly Maoism is a popular political current in a rural place like southern Mexico. And so these indigenous youth, over the course of 1968, not only kind of engaged with their teachers in terms of these alternative theories, but they also start to make demands for their own professionalization as bilingual teachers. Not just as kind of independent contractors in these development schemes, but actually to be recognized as full-fledged bilingual teachers. And so this is where you see the kind of early examples of bilingual education in Mexico. I think there are probably some parallels with the United States case that people could discuss in the discussion. So why does this matter? I think one of the things that we do as historians is we try to look at voices that haven't been told and include new voices, kind of add new actors into a broader story. And I think on one level, this is worth doing, right? The narratives that we have about 1968 in Mexico have marginalized other activists and other youth who participated in the similar politics. But I also think we can kind of do something more than that. I think that kind of highlighting and centering the experience of indigenous youth in 1968 Mexico actually changes the story of 1968, right? Not just in Mexico, but internationally. And it, I think, speaks kind of jives quite well with the previous presenters. What this experience of indigenous youth shows us is that it's not just urban, middle-class university students who are part of this year of revolt. It's not just, 1968 isn't just a campaign for liberal reforms of press freedoms or university expansion or access to education, all valuable goals. But I think what it shows is that 1968 was fundamentally a kind of experience of anti-colonialism and anti-racism, right? That those kind of political currents were central to 1968 for many people around the world. These youth also didn't just look north. They didn't just look to Paris, although there were connections to May of '68 and French activists came to Mexico City. But they also looked east towards Africa, and they looked towards Asia. They read people like Frantz Fanon and others and used the kind of new bubbling up of African decolonization movements to reevaluate their own experiences as indigenous people in Latin America. And it's, I think, in this way that 1968 kind of raises anew the question of colonialism among Native people in Mexico, but also I think you could make clear parallels to Native American activism in the United States or the importance of anti-colonialism and decolonization to various black power and black nationalist currents. And so indigenous Mexico is part and parcel of that phenomenon. And I think that is a very different kind of history of 1968 than some of the more kind of mundane ones that we are offered, right? About student revolt, kind of a depoliticized narration of 1968. And I think that this one that focuses on anti-racism, anti-colonialism, internationalism, is one that I think speaks much more powerfully to our own present moment, right? And it's also one that speaks to those sprinters, Tommy Smith and John Carlos, right? There's ways in which this was a moment of internationalism that connected a radical vision for a future, people from very diverse and distinct places in the world. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks to our wonderful panelists who have left us plenty of time for questions. And so that's what I'd like to do is to open it up to the audience now. Yes, sir.
Thank you, all three of you, for this wonderful presentation. One of the things that really stands out to me in my research and in my reading as well about the global 60s, global 1968, is not just this shared international revolutionary imagination, but also physical movement of people across borders. And this speaks to all three of your presentations to a certain extent, but especially Professor Wu and your book, Radicals on the Road. And so, for example, my studies are on the solidarity movements, the transnational solidarity movements of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, in particular the US and Latin America. And there's this huge movement of people across borders to do physical or other symbolic forms of solidarity work in Latin America and the Caribbean. And so what I'm currently working through trying to understand these interesting, complicated relationships between non-state actors who are often in opposition to their own state, working with state actors who are considered enemies of their state or non-state actors in the case of a guerrilla warfare movement that is not yet recognized on the international level with diplomatic relations between states. So I'm sort of wondering if you could maybe speak to the mechanics of this coordination, sometimes overt, sometimes clandestine relationships between non-state actors, and other states and that sort of thing. And I'd welcome comments from all three as well.
Thanks so much for your question. I'm really excited about your project and look forward to hearing more about it. When I was thinking about radicals on the road, when I was trying to make Asia visible as in the political imaginary, I thought about it very broadly. So I thought about the beats and the ways that they were fascinated with Asian religions, right? Buddhism, Hinduism. I thought about the New Age folks, and I thought about the New Left and Third World Left and their fascination with socialist Asia, but also the ways in which Gandhi hasn't had an influence on the nonviolence movement in the United States. And so I was really interested in these international conversations that were happening. And I was particularly interested in travel because, Benedict Anderson talks about we have an imagined national, we have an imagined nation, right? Nations are imagined forms of community because we don't know everybody. So we just imagine that we have a solid sense of solidarity. But in times of war, that imagined sense of solidarity can be radically, it can be bordered, right? That the people that we think of as our enemies, we can't imagine that there's a connection. And so to think about the face-to-face contact that does occur, that's so much more powerful, right? To be able to speak to someone who suffers the impact of war, to be able to see it in terms of eyewitness, that is so politically transformative. And that when you go and witness war, that you can bring it back and then be more persuasive, right, in sharing what is actually happening as opposed to the official representations. And it's interesting thinking about the ways in which travel gets curtailed and surveyed by the U.S. government. So it wasn't always clear, what type of disciplinary impact would be placed by the state on these political travelers. But on the other end, they are being hosted either by official state representatives or representatives that are closely connected with the state. So the Vietnamese Women's Union is affiliated in some ways with the state project. And they have a certain investment in presenting a particular image of what is happening in Vietnam or in China or in North Korea. And obviously, I think the US travelers are politically astute. So I think they can tell when they're being sold a line as opposed to feeling like they're actually having a genuine connection. So some of the travelers who go to North Korea just felt like they were being given propaganda. That, here, go read the collective works of Kim Il-sung and take it back to anti-war activists. And so they didn't feel a particular connection. They really thought that it was a staged representation of things that they were witnessing. In other instances, they really felt that, this is a genuine connection that I'm making with someone. And I think it might have been easier with Vietnam because they've had a long history of doing these type of friendship tours. They've had a long history of colonialism, and so trying to cultivate international friendship. And there was also, in some instances, a shared language, so French, right, the impact of colonialism. So that it wasn't translated through somebody, but that there could be potentially a direct communication. So I think all those are really fascinating dynamics in thinking about what is the political impact of travel. Those organizations still exist. So the Vietnam-U.S. Friendship Association still exists. And it's interesting to think about them in some ways as state actors because this is a state that is heavily impoverished in terms of resources. So one of the individuals is stationed in Eastern Europe, and his job, in order to help disseminate information throughout the world, is that he would wake up late at night because of the time difference, get news reports that are being sent from Vietnam, to find ways to kind of translate that. He's the one-person operation. He's borrowing the news equipment from people. I think he was based in Czechoslovakia. And physically mimeograph 100 copies, and then he's sharing it with people like Tom Hayden when they come by, right? And those stories and representations then get circulated among the U.S. radical left. So it's not like a state actor as we think of someone who's well-resourced and, right, these are kind of shoestring operations that are happening globally, but that it was seen as something that was essential to Vietnamese diplomacy, that these individuals were just as powerful, right, in the work that they're doing by meeting with anti-war activists, individuals who are non-state actors, right? In fact, they're oppositional to their own state, but that work, it was just as valuable as fighting on the battlefield or negotiating with people in Paris. So those are just some thoughts.
Thank you.
Did you want to have a chance to answer?
Oh, yeah. Are you,
Oh, well, personal mobility is quite difficult in Eastern Europe. There are all kinds of travel restrictions, but again, because Poland was in this liminal place, there were opportunities to travel, especially for young people, for students. And in fact, many of the commandos went to Western Europe before 1968. And they had conversations with all sorts of people in the West, with leftists, but also with Western journalists. I would have problems differentiating between state and non-state actors, I guess. I mean, they talked with Polish émigrés, they talked with Radio Free Europe, so I don't know if that's a state actor, but they talked with all sorts of people. But I also would be careful in terms of looking at this as some sort of borrowing or imitating. It's more of a process of assimilation, I think. So they gather all these ideas from outside, but how they play out, it's conditioned by the local dynamics.
did you want to jump in, Shane?
Sure, I can say something. I don't know if this is working. I think,
It is.
I mean, one organization that has both a global vision and global reach or activities is the CIA, right?
Yeah.
And so
Exactly.
in the conversation about the CIA is very much thinking globally, right? And they have these kind of famous reports about youth unrest internationally, and so there is that. I think in Mexico, in the case of Mexico, a lot of what's happening is in the aftermath of government repression in 1968. Many young people flee to the countryside, right? And so physical travel and kind of finding themselves in new environments where they're trying to engage in political organizing or other forms of activism, their physical movement is really important. I think there is a way, though, in which so much of, as other people have described, there's something about happening in this period in which people, even without having to physically move, start to understand local conflicts in a global language, right? So in Oaxaca, relatively rural, isolated region of southern Mexico, during this period, they start to frame local politics in terms of kind of the Cold War politics shaping Latin America, Cold War dictators in other countries. That language gets used to talk about local politics. And so I think that is worth us keeping in mind. And of course, there's ways in which, in terms of the activist community, things like report backs, right, in which one or two people are traveling and then are bringing that back and helping people think about their very particular local organizing in a global frame. That's, I think, very politically productive work that people are engaged in at the time.
David, you had a question?
I guess this is for Mahmoud Gorizada. Much better. I was thinking of Vlad Zubak's work on the Soviet 60s, and he argues, I think, if I remember it right, that there was a kind of counterculture 60s in the Soviet Union that was basically about individual expression, and that this kind of cultural rebellion had political manifestations. You've focused on the political, and I'm curious to what extent the cultural connotations of global revolt, especially looking toward the First World, had a kind of trajectory that might explain why the radicals that you talked about eventually become, you said, neoliberal. And I wondered if there's something about the individuality and the expressiveness of the counterculture that helps inculcate them with the idea that maybe a final good is individual expression and freedom and liberation, not of a class, but of a person.
That's a very interesting question. Thank you. Zubok talks about intellectuals in the Soviet Union, and he also has a different chronology for the counterculture. It starts in the 50s, right? 1956, the thaw, and then it ends in the early 1960s with the fall of Khrushchev. So it's a very interesting argument. But in my book, I try to focus on a wide variety of young people. So it's not only intellectuals. I I have to think about your question, I guess, the effect, but I think it's a very, it's a very productive way of thinking about, especially the students and the intellectuals, because they do have more contact with the West, with Western Europe. Whether that stress on individualism indeed comes to some extent from those interactions. But at the same time, I also want to emphasize that in 1968, the anti-Semitic campaign makes a very traumatic experience on Polish students to the extent that they start departing from Marxism in general, and they start doubting in the effectiveness of a Marxist rebellion against a self-proclaimed Marxist state. So I think there is there are many factors.
Nelson, last question, or?
I have a question about Poland too. I just say that I just want to say that just important personal. In Berkeley, in my circles, we were very excited by the work of Kuran and Moshulevsky, and I remember picketing. There was no Polish consulate in San Francisco, but there was the Polish airline, so we picketed the airline on behalf of them. Okay, but here's my question. Jeremy Surrey makes the point in his book Politics of Protest that détente was a response by Nixon on the one side and Brezhnev and others, and clearly in Poland too, to the generation of '68, and then in turn détente meant a thawing of the Cold War, and then that opens up kind of dialectically more space. Do you agree with that? I mean, and I was struck by you had a comment. Things turned out bad, but actually, I mean, we ended up 12 years later with solidarity. I mean, we did not. The neoliberalism is something, but we ended up with solidarity. So, what is your point of view?
I agree with Suri's argument about the tones. I see a lot of similarities in terms of how the communist regime reacts to upheavals from below. I mean, you can see this in the language as well. The vilification of young people it's almost the same language that they are using, that the regimes in the West are using. So, I mean, the similarities are really striking, and I think that this argument is valid.
We actually have time for one more question. Oh, there we go.
First, I'd just like to thank you guys for being here. This is the first panel I've been to at this college where it wasn't an all-white panel. So I'd just like to thank you for that. But also my question is more of like, as a student, during this time, like 50 years later, it seems to be that the only thing that we can do is be radical and not, be liberal. And it also feels like, although it is helping, like, I'm not sure to what extent protests and like student protests are actually creating a radical change. So my question is, what do you suppose would be the new radical, in comparison to '68?
Try and start. I think any engagement in protest matters. Patsy Ming protested against a Supreme Court nominee, I think it was in 1970, 71, because she argued that he was a disgrace to American womanhood. And he had made a ruling on a court case in which this woman had been discriminated economically based on being a woman and on being a mother. And the court said, well, that's too confusing. That's two things, right? She's being discriminated against. And so that's not really a basis for a fair employment case. And she was pointing out the importance of intersectionality, right? And that what this particular person does as a court judge makes a big difference. And that person is going to represent and interpret the highest level of law in our country. So this is an issue that obviously we should be thinking about. I love that statement when she says, I've run many times and I've lost many times. And she had lots of battles that she did not win. And in fact, in the 1990s, when she was trying to work to, say, welfare, like maybe you know more about this, but my sense was that they knew they were not going to win. They didn't have the votes. And so I was asking her daughter, who's a political scientist and an activist at that time, she just came out with a book on welfare. You know, like why keep fighting? And she's like, it's so important to record dissent. Like we can't let the people who are the victors be the only ones to have a mark in history. And so I think about the Me Too protests, and maybe it hasn't changed things at the political level, but it has changed things in terms of the entertainment industry. It's changing things in educational institutions. There was just an announcement about Google firing a certain significant number of employees because of sexual harassment. I think about the students who are protesting against guns in schools and gun violence. Every time I see something like that, it really heartens my soul, right? And that these are, especially the students, they're not going to be, and they will eventually vote, but they're not voters now. But they're holding their elders to political accountability. And I think that's what we all need to do. So I wouldn't say, well, liberalism doesn't work and radicalism doesn't work. I think it all. So go out and vote during the midterm election.
That's it. You want to follow up, Catherine? Anything you want to say?
Oh, no, thank you. Like, I feel like, I don't know, everything that we are, like, it feels so small, and it's hard to feel like that small changes are growing into that bigger change. And obviously when I say, like, protest doesn't work, like, that's an exaggeration. But, no, thank you.
It isn't small, though. Graduate students walked out the other day, meeting of the I have a loud voice.
We've met.
The meeting of the finance committee. Believe me, that was not a small gesture. And I think that Loyola is going to have to reckon with the unionization of the graduate student. It's just a question of time. So those students doing that was an extraordinarily brave gesture, which I think most of the faculty, if not all of the faculty, is behind. So keep on coming.
I'm actually I think we have to end on that fantastic note, and I'd like to thank, no, for that. No, but actually, that Catherine spoke up. It's always great to have, actually, I will say, it's great to have at a conference on a university, a student actually ask a question, and the final question at that, and a great one. But it also, I'm gonna use it shamelessly as a segue that tomorrow we actually are gonna spend a lot of time talking about students. We not only have Mexico in 68, but more importantly, I'm really excited about a panel on years of the student, 68 and 2018, where we have student activists from today and student activists from 1968, and I encourage everyone here to come. But in the meantime, we have a fantastic keynote tonight from Julian Borg, and I hope you all join us back here at 7:30. 7:30, and I can't wait. So take an hour and a half off. Enjoy. Or hour and 45 minutes, whatever it is. See y'all later.